In this time of enormous change in which we live, among other things, the world missionary enterprise is now called into question. In the words of one author, Maltman, well-known author, he says, "This period of Western missions, with its opportunities and burdens, is irrevocably coming to an end." Wilfred Cantrell Smith, a Presbyterian scholar from North America, says, "The missionary enterprise is in profound and fundamental crisis. The missionary situation of the church is in profound crisis in both practice and theory." First, we say something about the effectiveness of the world missionary enterprise. For the first 1800 years of Christianity, for the most part, Christianity remained confined to a small area of the earth, namely to Western Europe, and was to a large extent a phenomena confined to that small part of the world. Beyond the first century, as the Christian movement developed in Europe, there were very few vital efforts to take the gospel beyond the borders of Christendom. And even in the time of the Great Reformation, the evangelical awakening of the 16th century, there was no burden to take the gospel beyond the boundaries of Christendom. It remained an agitation within the Western Church. You can read the writings of Luther. He appears to possess no burdens to bring the gospel to the Arabs. And rather embarrassingly, the only thing he seems to be able to do in reference to the Arabs is rail on them. But 200 years ago, there was a great change. There was an awakening to the responsibility of world missions. Much of it was concentrated, that vision, in this country. And if you look at the 19th century, you'll find that there was a tremendous amount of idealism that fired the American spirit. In many respects, the American nation have been a nation of tremendous idealists. Up until the Vietnam War, it seems that it was considered nothing was impossible to the Americans. If you put enough effort, organisational genius and money into it, you could do it. So with a tremendous amount of energy and idealism, the church awoke to the responsibility of missionising the whole world. And it was envisaged that before too long, there would not be one part of the world that had not been exposed to the Christian gospel. In some respects, that missionary enterprise was successful. Some have pointed out it has been most successful among the heathen cultures of the world, where you have very backward, degenerate, heathen type of cultures, such as in places like New Guinea and places like Africa, although it must remember that these same areas of the world were also open to the competing missionary movements such as Islam. But when we look at the great world religions and those established cultures that are associated with the great world religions, we have to say that Christianity has made no great impact. Indeed, 1/4 of the world today has been exposed to Christianity. 3/4 of the world still remains unexposed to Christianity, and statisticians tell us that the balance is not going in favour of Christianity, but now rather against it. As it was for 1800 years, so it still remains. in spite of all the missionary activity of the last 200 years and world missionary enterprise, the vast proportion of the nations of this earth, the teeming millions of this earth, have been shut away from the New Testament viewpoint. Mass conversions from one religion to the other just do not happen, at least in this context. John Hick has written, a Harvard scholar, on surveying the situation of the great religions of the world, that for 99% of people in the world, their religion is determined simply by the place in which they happen to be born. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, it would be 99% chance that you would be a Muslim, either a devout one or a nominal one. If you're born in North America or Australia, you'd have 99% chance of being statistically numbered in the Christian religion, either a devout one or a nominal one. So for 99% of the people on the earth, religion is determined by the place where they were born. It is a matter of chance or accident. Realism forces us to recognize that for the teeming millions of this earth, as it has been for 2,000 years, there is no realistic expectation that most of these people on planet Earth will ever be exposed to the Christian message. The reality of this is forced upon, especially upon one who travels, but I think it's being forced upon all of us because more and more we're living in a global village. Just recently, my wife and I travelled to some places in Southeast Asia. We went through the Philippines, visited some friends there. We went on to southern China. But to see the masses of people crowded into those cities is really an overpowering impression. One leaves a tremendous impression on one's consciousness. Just to see the masses of blackheads, people like ants, crowded into those streets. When we got back to the city of Brisbane, not a very small city, 1 million people, it seemed that the place was deserted. It was like a cemetery. But as we were going through one place in southern China, and just masses of human beings, I couldn't help remarking to my wife a remark that some of you will not appreciate because you do not have a certain sectarian background that I have. But some of you will know what I mean. I said to her, I wonder how many of these people have ever heard the third angel's message. Now, if you don't know what the third angel's message is, well, forget about it. You're not any poorer for it. But the point is, how many of those people had ever heard the Christian message? Practically none. They've been born without it. And there's nothing that you can do, apparently. We may be idealistic, but I'm asking that we be realistic. They've been born without the Christian message. Here are masses and masses of human beings. There's nothing that you can do about it. There's nothing that I can do about it is going to change the situation. They're going to die without it. It's not we've found even in our Christian, those of us who share a common Christian heritage, it's not easy to break across barriers. Even of fellow Christians who share a common Western Christian heritage. How hard it is for a Lutheran to convince a non-Lutheran that his view of the supper is right. How hard it is for a non-Lutheran to convince a Lutheran that his view of the supper is right. How hard it is for those who come from a background of infant baptism to see the validity of the Baptist point of view or vice versa. And yet we share a common Western heritage. It is very, very difficult to break through even those small cultural barriers. Let alone take the great step of people of an alien culture locked away with a completely other worldview and a religious viewpoint. And as I say, despite all the ideal efforts of the last 200 years of Christian missions, what has been our impact? Practically nil. This statement I read from a book that's edited by John Hick. It's called Christianity and the Other Religions, but here one essayist calls to witness the words of Canon Max Warren, the General Secretary in London of the Church Missionary Society. This is what he says. He sums up the world missionary enterprise in 3 sentences. We have marched around alien Jerichos the requisite number of times. We have sounded the trumpets, and the walls have not collapsed. Not only is the effectiveness of the world missionary enterprise called into question, but the methodology is also called into question. There have been a number of very thoughtful books that have called into question the methodology of Western missions. We have failed to appreciate that Christianity, as it developed in Western Europe, was something that was influenced by Latin and Germanic culture. In fact, one who is but casually acquainted with the historical development of Christianity, our kind of Christianity, has to be impressed that outside of that certain Latin and Germanic culture, that kind of Christianity could not have developed. Now, I know sometimes we pride ourselves to be the people of the book. We think our religious viewpoint dropped straight out of the New Testament era, and we get our religion straight from the Bible. Of course, that's a dream. That just doesn't happen. The way we do theology, the way we think, is deeply affected by the culture, the age in which we live. And so the way Western Christianity developed was deeply influenced by Latin culture, a Latin way of thinking, a Germanic spirit, which determined the shape of theology and the questions that were asked and the theological systems and the institutions that had been developed. And so that is our heritage. But then, taking our cultural expression of Christianity, we go off to other cultures. And with our Western insensitivity, we barge in and very often break up other cultures, disorientate people, make them rootless. Very often when people have accepted in some of these other cultures the Christian message, they've been so dislocated from their own people, about the only thing they can do is go and live on the missionary compound and wash the missionaries' clothes or something. So there's been a lot of soul searching on this business of the methodology of the world missionary enterprise. We've had to abandon the idea that the first century was a century of missions, and we dropped it for many centuries, and we took it up again in the 19th and 20th century. Well, actually, if we look at Paul's vision of the world missionary enterprise, it was quite different. The way we've missionized has been more like Paul's opponents. They were Jewish Christians. They were steeped in a Jewish culture, which they felt was the ideal culture, God's culture. They had the Torah. At least they knew how to live better than any people upon the earth. And they naturally assumed, when they became believers in Jesus Christ and took up the missionary enterprise, that they were to take their whole culture and impose it on the Gentile people. That was the conflict all about it. In other words, they would be circumcised, they would keep the Sabbath, they would eat kosher food. And they wanted to impose the whole package of Jewish culture on the Gentile believers in Jesus Christ. In other words, it sounds a bit to me like, if you really look at the facts, we've been guilty. In our world missionary enterprise, it looks to me like, if we look at the facts, we have been guilty of a lot of Judaizing in a modern type of sense. But this is associated with a spirit that is really alien to the gospel of Jesus Christ. This has been so well expressed by Wilfred Cantrell Smith, in this book that I've referred to, that I want to read some of his comments here at length. My submission is that on this front the traditional doctrinal position of the Church has in fact militated against its traditional moral position and has in fact encouraged Christians to approach other men immorally. He's talking about this same dilemma that we highlighted in the last session. We have a sort of a commitment to the truth that forces us to act immorally toward other people. Christ has taught us humility, but we have approached them with arrogance. I do not say this lightly. This charge of arrogance is a serious one. It is my observation over more than 20 years of study of the Orient and a little now of Africa, that the fundamental flaw of Western civilization in its role in world history is arrogance. And this has infected also the Christian church. I submit here that maybe he's a little wrong. I'm wondering whether or not Western civilization has also been infected by Christianity with arrogance. But however, he's dealing with the arrogance of the Western missionary enterprise. If you think that I am being reckless, he says, or unwarranted here, ask any Jew or read between the lines the works of modern African or Asian thinkers. In other words, he's saying our fundamental stance in our missionary thrust, in our missionary enterprise, is permeated. The way we have tried to missionize and related to these other cultures and other peoples have not heard the Christian message, our fundamental stance has been permeated with arrogance. And what he suggests here, he says, that's hard to swallow. He says, try and see it from their point of view. You go and ask these other non-Christians whether or not it's been arrogant. They'll tell you the truth. May I take for illustration a phrase, not unrepresentative, which was under discussion recently by the United Church of Canada's Commission of Faith, in which ran as follows. Without the particular knowledge of God in Jesus Christ, men do not really know God at all. End of quote. Let us leave aside for the moment any question of whether or not this is true. We shall return to that presently. My point here is simply that in any case it is arrogant. At least it becomes arrogant when one carries it out to the non-Western world. In the quiet of the study, it may be possible for the speculative mind to produce this kind of doctrine, provided that one keeps it purely bookish. But except at the cost of insensitivity or delinquence, it is morally not possible actually to go out into the world and say to devout, intelligent fellow human beings, we are saved and you are damned. We believe that we know God and we are right. You believe that you know God and you are totally wrong. This is intolerable from merely human standards. It is doubly so from Christian ones. any position that antagonises, that alienates rather than reconciles, that is arrogant rather than humble, that is unlovely, is ipso facto unchristian. Now let me say something about this, just if I may digress here, and I'll go back to Cantrell Smith in a moment, about this situation of Christian arrogance, sectarian arrogance. I was brought up in a sect of the Christian church that professed and had a marvellous ethical ideal in reference to one's fellow men. In fact, a sect of the Christian church, or a segment of the Christian church, deeply involved in many, many laudable humanitarian works for one's fellow men. But the problem was, I was saddled with a doctrine, with a belief, that I was bound, I felt bound to believe, out of loyalty to God, namely, that this group, this little denomination to which I belong, was the one true church in all the earth. There was only one, and that was it. Now, and not only that, but all other Christian denominations, all other Christian groups were part of Great Babylon. Oh yes, we recognise God had many of his people out there, but before the end came, one had to get them out of those religious groups into your religious group, otherwise they were going to get to the mark of the beast. That's not exaggerating, that's the raw truth of what this situation amounted to. Now, of course, my ethic told me I should not be arrogant. I should be very humble about belonging to this special group. But being saddled with this situation, if one was humble about it, one was still forced to be arrogant about one's humility. Very hard not to be arrogant. You have a situation where your theology forces you to be arrogant. Now, not only that, I believed in keeping a special day holy. Now, if I read Romans 14 correctly, a person can be a good Christian and keep a certain day holy. If what is done out of loyalty to Christ, great. I mean, if you want to eat grass like Nebuchadnezzar and do it out of loyalty to Christ, great. But Paul's point is, don't be arrogant about it. Don't be judgmental to other Christians. Now, my problem is this. As a human being, I'm so inclined to be judgmental of others who don't see my way of thinking that I don't want any theological help to be judgmental. Do you know what I mean? But here I was, saddled with a theology that made me judgmental toward those who didn't share my particular viewpoints. And so, my loyalty to the truth here forced me in a position where it was impossible not to be arrogant. And sort of gave one, and this is the mischievous part about it, is it gave one theological justification to be arrogant. I mean, it's bad enough just being arrogant and being disposed to be arrogant. But when you come along and give a person theological justification to being like that, well, you've really got a burden, haven't you? Now, some of us were exposed to the gospel, and I know many shared a similar pilgrimage, and because we were exposed to another spirit of the gospel, there came in this irreconcilable tension where one could not stomach this sectarian arrogance any longer. In obedience to the gospel, one had to give up this idea of belonging to the only one true church in all the earth. That you were right and everybody else was wrong. So, I became a sectarian refugee and became a kind of exponent on the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith through publication of all sorts of material in Verdict and so on. And I got invited to all sorts of other places. Lutheran seminaries and reform schools and situations. And I made an amazing thing was forced upon my consciousness. These children of the reformers, I never found such arrogance in all my life. I don't want to be unkind to anybody. But it was a terrible awakening, as if I got over to another situation and there was a sort of a familiar smell about the environment. I was just, oh my life. I've struck that before, and I thought, can't, that's intolerable. Let me go over here to this Christian group. And you, arrogance. And so I found that the Lutherans weren't any different from the Adventists. The Calvinists weren't a whit better. Sometimes I had the sneaking suspicion they might have been worse. And you could go, Church of Christ, Baptist, this group, that group. And it's forced me right back to say, is the Christian religion arrogant? Is Wilfred Canfield Smith correct? Let me read on. He says, further, there is a further point at which the traditional position seems to me morally unchristian. From the notion that if Christianity be true, then other religions must be false, a notion whose logic I shall challenge later, it is possible to go to the converse position that if anyone's else faith turns out to be valid or adequate, then it would follow that Christianity must be false, a form of logic that has, in fact, driven many from their own faith, and indeed from any faith at all. If one's chances of getting to heaven are dependent upon others, people not getting there, then one becomes walled up with the quite intolerable position that the Christian has a vested interest in other men's damnation. It is shocking to admit it, but this actually takes place. When an observer comes back from Asia or from the study of Asian religious traditions and reports that, contrary to the accepted theory, some Hindus and Buddhists and some Muslims lead a pious and moral life and seem very near to God by any possible standards, so that, so far as one can see, in these particular cases, at least faith is as adequate as Christian faith, then presumably a Christian should be overjoyed, enthusiastically hopeful that this be true, even though he might be permitted a fear that it may not be. Instead, I have sometimes witnessed just the opposite, an emotional resistance to the news, men hoping firmly that it is not so, though perhaps with a covert fear that it might be. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation theoretically, I submit that practically this is just not Christian, and indeed it is not tolerable. It will not do to have a faith that can be undermined by God saving one's neighbour, or to be afraid lest other men turn out to be closer to the God than one had been led to suppose. In the year 1960, some of the leading evangelical Christians of this nation got together in Chicago for the Congress on World Missions and issued this official statement. In the years since the war, more than 1 billion souls have passed into eternity, and more than half of these went to the torment of hellfire without ever hearing of Jesus Christ, who he was, or why he died on the cross of Calvary. Now, I want to suggest that that statement is not only a terrible, arrogant statement, but it's absolutely intolerable. Leaving aside the question of a crude view of hell, which sometimes paints God up to be a torturer that would make the greatest torturers of human history look like mere Sunday school picnickers. This arrogant presupposition, this certainty of the lostness of all people who have never been exposed to our viewpoint of things, I suggest is contrary to the whole spirit of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This leads me to raise some very serious questions. And in our final session we may set about to try and answer some of them. But first let me raise some questions. I think one of the liberties we have been given as free people in Christ is the liberty to ask very serious questions. Now it's strange how that liberty is denied the people of God in... Certainly it's denied by the spirit of fundamentalism. God gives us the freedom to ask some very serious questions, I believe. Number one, if the Christian message is absolutely essential for salvation, if the Christian message is absolutely essential for salvation, that is, hearing it, being exposed to the New Testament viewpoint, hearing that and believing it, if that is absolutely essential for salvation, I don't know how I can escape the conclusion that it looks to me that God doesn't care too much about the great mass of humanity. For 2,000 years, for the most part, Christianity has only been confined to a small portion of this globe. The great mass of human beings, even today, with all our modern communications and everything, the great mass of human beings on this earth have never been exposed to the New Testament viewpoint, and as things now stand, there's not even a realistic hope of a breakthrough. And it would have to seem to me that if hearing and believing that Christian message is the only way of salvation, is absolutely necessary for salvation, it seems to me that the evidence points me in the direction God doesn't really care for the great mass of nations of this earth. Or does he? That's my question. My second question. In the light of the evidence that we're forced to look at over 2,000 years, does God seriously intend all the peoples of all these nations to embrace public Christianity? Does God seriously intend it? Now I recognise that some people at this point come along and they say, yes, God seriously intends it, but the problem is he's left it to us to take the gospel to these people, and we haven't done our task. So their salvation actually depends upon us bringing it to them. Now, to this proposition I raise the question. It's very clear to me that in the Bible I'm not saved by what I do, right? I'm not saved by my works. But are you going to present to me the proposition that but my neighbour is saved by my works? I'm not saved by my works, but my neighbour is. My salvation does not depend upon my good works, but my neighbour's salvation is going to depend upon my good works. let's take an example. Here is a pious Mormon. He's working in the archives, doing some diligent research in genealogy. He wants to be baptized for all his ancestors so that he can bring to them everlasting blessedness. Now we say that doesn't seem to be reasonable, that's not even sensible, that the God of wisdom and justice leaves the salvation of these people suspended upon the research of this pious little Mormon working down in the archives. Suppose he gets run over by a truck before he does his research. Suppose his research is defective. Suppose his zeal flags. And yet the salvation of all these people that he's being baptized for depends on what he does. I say that's not worthy of serious consideration. So we move on to the pious Catholic. Here is the pious Catholic involved in intercession to God and works of charity or whatever it might be in order to expedite the stay of his loved ones in purgatory. Now, I'm no expert how to get souls out of purgatory, but we'll accept at least the general principle that what the believing, living, pious Catholic does has something to do with how long these people are going to stay in purgatory. Well, we say that's not sensible either, from the same principle as the Mormon principle is not sensible. Yet sometimes we evangelical Christians say that God leaves the salvation of these billions wholly suspended now on what we do and the effectiveness of our missionary enterprise. Well, I have to call that into question. And another question. And what about all these people who've been turned off Christ by our marvellous missionary witness? And don't suppose that never happens, it often does. And we bring such a distorted picture of Christ to people that out of a deeper loyalty to the truth, which is loyalty to Christ, out of loyalty to Christ, they reject Christ. Are they damned too? I read the story of what happened in South America when the Spanish tried to Christianize the heathen. A Franciscan conquistador stood before a king in Peru, and he gave him the choice right on the spot to be baptized or to die by the sword. When he didn't rapidly make his decision, the Franciscan cut both his hands off. And then he said, I'll give you the final choice. You can be baptized and go straight to heaven. And the king said to him, he said, no thanks, I might meet someone else there just like you. That's happened again and again. I don't know, I can think of people I'd borne my testimony to. Tried to get them into the truth. In a lot of cases I feel like going back and apologising to. And thank the Lord that they had more honesty and more sense than to accept my testimony. So I raise the question, what about all the people who out of a deep sense of loyalty to the truth have been forced to go outside the church, who have been forced to reject Christ out of loyalty to Christ? Are they damned? And finally, isn't it the most basic tenet of the gospel, after all, that we're not saved by our doing, but by the anguish and love of God that has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ? And isn't there a danger of when we posit the premise of salvation through our knowing, that our knowing can be very easily another form of salvation by our doing. These are some of the serious questions that one must raise in view of the world missionary crisis, as both the effectiveness and the methodology of the worldwide missionary enterprise is now called into question.